There we go. All right. Well, Rob, would you feel comfortable praying us in this morning? Come ahead. Okay. Well, welcome everybody and happy holidays. We are between the big ones, Christmas and New Year's, and I'm hoping that everybody is having a good time, enjoying the time off if you got it, or at least hopefully some reduced uh, obligations and so forth as we phase out the 2024 and welcome in 2025. But here we are. We are in the book of Acts. We are in chapter 12. I'm serving as your tour guide for a look at Acts and some of the things that we kind of summarize or casually just gloss through. We were introduced to some characters last Sunday when we saw about the story of Peter. We saw that persecution has broken out against the church. Again, things were just going too well as far as Satan was concerned, and he decides to take another bite at the apple, see what he can do about intimidating folks at the very least, and in some cases arranging for people to be put to death, thanks to a guy named Herod, who arrests James, the brother of John, and has him beheaded. And this meets with the big approval of the Jewish religious leaders. And he gets such a positive reaction. He says, "Hey, I'm going to do that again." So he arrests what he considers to be the really big guy. That would be Peter. Peter is in prison. The church members are praying earnestly for his release. And one night, in fact, the night before Peter is to be brought out for trial and probably summary execution, an angel appears in the prison, frees Peter. And allows him to go back to the house of Mary, where he knocks on the gate, says, "Hey, I'm here, let me in." And we had this little humorous, I would say outright funny situation where the church group that has been praying for his release refuses to believe it's really him. "Oh, ye of little faith." Hey, you can't be serious. It must be his ghost. Maybe that's what you saw. Thankfully, Peter is a hearty soul. Doesn't take no for an answer easily. Keeps banging on the door. They finally let him in. And tells them what happened, and he says, "Tell James and the other brethren about this." And then he leaves for another place. Not the last time we'll see Peter, but he's going to be taking a vacation from us for a couple of chapters. Of course, there's in the morning there is no, as Luke puts it in his narrative, there was no small commotion when everybody wakes up. Herod sends for his special prisoner, and he is nowhere to be found. And of course, under the custom of the way Rome runs things, if you are put in charge of guarding a prisoner and he escapes and you cannot account for his absence, then you suffer the same fate that was going to happen to him. And that means for all those who were appointed to guard Peter, they're executed upon orders of Herod. Well, we're about to have a little episode here about Herod in the closing verses of chapter 12. So let's talk a little bit about Herod and who he is. That's that's a big name. It's almost like a brand name, like Ford was to automobiles, and maybe Hearst would be to newspapers, and Kardashian would be to, well, whatever, big culture. Herod was to dictators and tyrants. In fact, the guy Herod that we're looking at today is not necessarily the same Herod that we have looked at in earlier accounts in the Gospels. This Herod was by the name of Herod Agrippa the First. He was the nephew of Herod Antipas, who did play a role, or who stood by as Jesus was put to death. He was the grandson of Herod the Great. I guess that there's a pecking order in terms of how great or how terrible they were, but it was his granddad, that Herod the Great, that we were introduced to in the Gospels. Of course, that's when the Magi come and start asking about, hey, we've come to honor and look and celebrate the birth of the King of the Jews. That's not happy news for Grandpa Herod. He says, I've got a rival here, got to take care of him. He hopes that the visit from the Magi will smoke out this purported king. When that doesn't happen, when God arranges for them to take a different return route home, he flies and he becomes angry and arranges for every tot and babe that is 2 years or younger to be put to death, which was a really awful decision for him to make. But that gives you an idea about who these Herods were. They were tin horn dictators. They were tyrants. Um, they could almost have, if they had a PR agency fronting for them, they would probably have come up with a slogan like, "When you think of tyrants, think of Herod," because that was kind of like a brand name almost. Um, Not a happy family. These were folks that one or more Herods were not above putting family members to death if they felt like, hey, this guy could be in competition for my job. Well, I'll just take care of him. This was, you can almost imagine what the Thanksgiving dinners were like. Just they were not a happy bunch at all. But this is at least the third Herod that we have encountered in the Gospels, and as I say, his name is uh, Herod Agrippa, and he's called king. All the Herods called themselves kings. When you hear the term king in this context, please take it lightly, because remember, after all, they are part of the Roman Empire. And you only have one head guy in charge. That's the emperor over in Rome. And Herod called himself king basically by the forbearance and the open mindedness of the Roman government. It was kind of a nod, nod, wink, wink. Hey, yeah, call yourself whatever you want, just keep everybody in order. Technically, um, Herod was in charge of the province, of governing the province of Judea. He would be kind of the closest analogy to today's politics. He would be more like a governor of a state. If he were ruling part of the United States, he would be a state governor, kind of, sort of. But with one exception, he answered to the emperor in Rome. And of course, he held his job by the mercy and by the grace of the Roman rulers. As long as you keep things in line, as long as you keep things in order, then yeah, you can go on ruling, doing whatever you want, just so long as anything you do is in support of the Roman government. And as we said earlier, you keep things in order. No unseemly riots or protests, much less any kind of effort against overthrowing the government. We just don't like those things. And if you can't take care of problems like that, we'll find somebody who can. So that was King Herod. king somewhat, definitely a ruler, although not an absolute ruler, but enough to where he could order people to be put to death if it served his purposes. Um, Luke does not go into much detail about Herod's state of mind or how upset he might have been about Peter's disappearance, other than putting the guards to death. But he just goes on with his narrative as we pick up in verse 19, or the latter part of verse 19, where his story continues. Then Herod went from Judea to Caesarea and stayed there. Um, this was that's an interesting way of putting it, because technically he was still in Judea. More precisely, what Luke may have been referring to was that Herod finally left Jerusalem and he went to the place that was to the city, Caesarea. So many Caesareas in the Roman Empire, and basically named after, of course, the ruling Caesar of the time. It was Caesarea, and then fill in the blank of the name of the emperor that you wanted to honor. But Caesarea would have been technically the provincial capital of as far as the Romans were concerned, of the province of Judea. Used to be Jerusalem, but the Romans moved it. So Herod basically returns back to his office, and he stayed there. And Luke allows the fact that, among other things he was dealing with, he had some political issues with some of Judea's, or the province's, nearby neighbors. He had been angry. He had been quarreling with the people of Tyre and Sidon. We're familiar with those two cities because long ago, King David, King Solomon did business with the people in those cities, basically buying and selling, mostly buying materials, especially when they began building the temple and the king's palace. So there's this relationship that has gone on and through the decades, through the centuries. Not in a happy place right now, because there's some quarreling, as Luke will later tell us. As you may recall, there's a drought on. A couple of chapters ago, a prophet by the name of Agabus came up to Paul and Barnabas in Antioch, and basically says, "Hey guys, there's fixing to be a drought that's going to put everybody in a bad place," and that as a result of that, Saul and Barnabas take up a collection from the Antioch church, and they are on their way up to Jerusalem to deliver it to the church there, to the church members, many of whom are poor and basically are going to be in need of some kind of assistance. So while that is going on, here's another aspect of that drought going on. There's a quarrel, there's a dispute, there's some unhappiness between King Herod and his neighbors over in Tyre and Sidon. And those people, at least the political and business leaders, get together, and they sought an audience with Herod. And they do so by securing the support of Blastus, a trusted personal servant of Herod. And so by asking for political appeals, they send a message to Herod that says, "Hey, Herod, don't be angry with us. We can work this out. Let's be friends." And so that kind of works out. And the main reason why they're asking for a peaceful resolution to whatever dispute they're having, is because they depended on the king's country, that would be, of course, Judea, for their food supply. This drought is widespread. It affects pretty much everyone, as far as you can see. So their food supplies are running short. They go to the ruling governor, the man in charge of that province, and said, "Hey, can't we work something out?" Apparently they do. And apparently, as part of that package, they're going to stick around and pay respect to King Herod. Verse 21. On the appointed day, we're not sure what that day is or what it was about, but anyway, they pick a day where they're going to have this festival, this ceremony, and Herod appears wearing his royal robes. We're not talking about, anytime I hear robes, if it's not a judge, it's either a judge's robe or it's a bathrobe. So I have very little imagination there. But according to the historian Josephus, uh, what Herod was wearing was not just any robe, wasn't terry cloth or anything like that. He was wearing a garment made wholly of silver, pure silver robe. You can imagine how shiny it was and how reflective it was, especially if he's outdoors, and this is outdoors, and it's in the middle of the day, broad daylight. You can imagine what effect it has on the sun shining down on it. Everybody who looks at him is going, ah, ah, ah. I don't think they had sunglasses back then, so all you had to do is just avert your gaze, because he was just this. He must have been, to most of the audience, he must have been not much more than this big ball of light, thanks to that robe. But of course, the robe is for a reason. It's to, hey, look at how important I am. I mean, I am just this robe, and this glow around me is indicative of how important and how wonderful I am. You can imagine. So anyway, he wears this wonderful robe. He appears before the crowd, sits on his throne, and he delivered a public address to the people. You can probably saying, hey, thanks to my wonderfulness, we're solving the problems of people of Tyre and Sidon, where they're going to get their food, or something like that. And probably a little bit more about that. Apparently, this was a very eloquent speech. It may have been extremely eloquent, maybe a speech for the centuries, although we don't know exactly what it was that he said. Either a speech for the century, or the people around knew which side their bread was buttered on and said, humor him, whatever he says. I don't care if he starts talking about his cat. Just applaud where you think there's going to be an applause line. You clap as hard as you can. They do more than that. Verse 22. The people shouted, "This is the voice of a God, not of a man." Ooh, that's laying it on thick. They may or may not have been sincere about it, but the point here is not necessarily what the people were thinking. The point here was what Herod was thinking. Herod is just drinking it all up. Oh man, these people love me. And they're smart people, because they know exactly who I am, how wonderful I am. I really am like a God. It really went to his head with tragic results. God decides to intervene, because apparently there's some confusion on Herod's part as to who is God. God's going to clarify the matter, at least for a few people. Luke writes, verse 23, immediately, because Herod did not give praise to God. Herod did not deflect the praise. He said, he could have said something like, hey, thank you for your applause and your confidence and so forth, but there's only one God. And of course, Herod was not Jewish. They were, he and the other Herods were Edomites. They were first cousins to the Jews, close enough to where and of course, as ruling a province that included the Jewish religious system, he would be very, very well aware of who God was, and how he was to be worshipped, and how most people worshiped him. So he could have deflected that. He chose not to. And because he chose not to, because Herod did not give praise to God, Luke writes, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died. Thank you, Dr. Luke, for that info. Maybe that's a little bit more than some of us who are squeamish really wanted to know. Yuck. But that would definitely have been, hey, you're healthy one moment, the next thing you know, you've fallen dead, or you're encountering this very, very painful death. Josephus continues in his account. He said that his flatterers cried out. Of course, when somebody who's flattering you, means that what they're telling you is what they think you want to hear. They're not necessarily telling you the truth. But because his flatterers cried out, though, and then in parentheses, though not for his good, and this definitely was the result, a severe pain arose in Herod's belly, and he died after 5 days. There are other accounts that said, yeah, Herod encountered some weird kind of intestinal disease that was incurable. And it was incurable and painful. And so all he could do was just suffer as he finally died. But according to Luke's account, worms. Now you can, medical folks will probably speculate on how he got, how that happened. It could also have been that this was because God was making a decisive judgment here. It was a supernatural thing. With God, anything can happen, especially in a situation like that. Herod could have been a picture of health one moment and then dead the next. God could have seen to it. Well, Herod came to a bad end, and unfortunately, apparently, according to other historical accounts, that did not mean an end to the line of Herods. The Herod dynasty would go on. This particular Herod, met a very unhappy and painful end. But, as Luke tells us, verse 24, the word of God continued to spread and flourish. It grew and multiplied. So, a very unhappy end for Herod, who decided that it would be good political positioning to persecute the church. When you persecute the church, when you persecute God's people, you do it at your own risk. That ends the story of Herod, and that really should end chapter 12. But because there's this little scraggly verse 25, that really belongs, it really should be the lead off to chapter 13. But unfortunately, nobody asked me about how to separate chapters and verses. So, we have to go with the flow here. But that little scraggly verse that we will pick up on when we get into chapter 13 basically starts the next big epic story in Acts. And it tells us that when Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission, and that mission would have been to deliver the money that had been raised by the people in Antioch. They went from Antioch to Jerusalem, delivered the money, and now they now returned from Jerusalem, taking with them John, remember, also called Mark. It was Mark's residence that the church people were praying for Peter, and that Peter visited earlier in the chapter. So, and we talked a little bit about Mark, who was a close associate of Peter. And Mark is going to accompany Saul and Barnabas on some work, at least initially. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But that closes up chapter 12 for us. we'll be next week. We're going to get into chapter 13 and some of the things that Saul and Barnabas will encounter along the way. So, if you will, please take a look at chapter 13. Look it over sometime this week, and Lord willing, that's where we will meet back here with next Sunday. I want to thank you for your time, and I hope you got something out of the lesson. And have a great week. Happy New Year. Please celebrate carefully and safely. And I hope your team or teams win on these as these playoffs continue. Anyway, not to make anybody feel bad, but hook 'em. Okay, I'll say that, and I feel I'm in good company saying that. Anyway, thanks all, and have a great week.